Dragons in the Waters by Madeleine L'Engle. 9. Port of Call. Simon woke up suddenly, not knowing where he was. The early morning light shimmered on the white ceiling of the cabin. Not the cabin he had shared with Cousin Forsyth, where drawn curtains kept the light to a minimum, where Cousin Forsyth's snores were now only an echo. No, he was in Dr. O'Keefe's cabin. He was in Dr. O'Keefe's bunk. He raised himself on his elbow and looked across to the other bunk. Charles was lying there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. When Simon moved, he sat up and smiled. Simon smiled back, but he felt empty. Something was missing. The loss of Quentin Fair was far larger than the loss of Cousin Forsyth. He did not want to talk about it, so he said, "It's not nearly time for breakfast." He stretched. His pajamas were slightly damp with perspiration. The cabin fan was whirring, and they had slept without even a sheet. The Herald Angel is probably in the galley making early coffee for the Smiths, Charles assumed his Buddha position and lapsed into silence. Simon broke the silence by asking, "Is he one? The Herald? I think so. You know the clouds we've been watching after lunch, very light and transparent, and they seem to be throwing themselves into the wind. And we've all said they look as though they're having such fun. I remember. I've never seen clouds like them before. Well, I dreamed last night that Geraldo and Jan both had wings of clouds, and they were flying above the ship, but flying is too heavy a word. It was a lovely dream to have had last night. Geraldo and Jan, they're on the side of the angels, as the saying goes. Don't worry about Geraldo. He won't do anything to hurt Polly." Simon thought about this for a moment, then he said, "Thank you, Charles. I've been being jealous. I know Polly's still my friend, even if she's friends with Geraldo in a different way. That was a lovely dream." A shadow moved across Charles's eyes. "They're not always lovely, but Canon Tallis tells me that I may not reject the gift because God does not give us more than we can bear. If there is a God." Polly was very upset when Daddy wouldn't cable him. "God?" Simon asked in surprise. "Uncle Father, Canon Tallis. But I think Daddy was really very relieved that Mr. Theo just went ahead and phoned." "You'll like Uncle Father, Simon." "I suppose if you and Polly like him that I will." "He's not going to be like anybody you've ever met before. One of our friends described him as looking like a highly intelligent teddy bear, but that's not a very good description because teddy bears are hairy and he's completely bald. I mean completely, even to having ridges of bone showing above his eyes where most people have eyebrows." "How come he's completely bald?" Charles was standing by the wash bowl, starting to brush his teeth. He took his toothbrush out of his mouth and spat. "He was tortured. Way back in some war, one of those awful ones in the Far East. They used electric shock on him, and it was so strong that it killed all his hair follicles. And it almost killed him, but he didn't betray his men. He was a soldier? A chaplain. But he went with the men wherever they went. That's the kind of person he is. That's why Polly wanted Daddy to send for him, and it's also why Daddy didn't want to. Shall we get dressed and go out on deck?" "Is it all right?" Simon asked. "Your father told us to keep the door locked." "I think it's all right as long as we stay together. Let's see if the pool is filled. Salt water is much nicer than a shower." They made their way along the quiet passage. The passengers were still in their cabins behind the chintz curtains. The rest of the ship was silent. No early morning sounds of laughter or of music. The silence was as oppressive as the heat. Simon tried to break it by whistling a few bars of "I Met Her in Venezuela," and broke off in mid-melody, thinking Quentin might almost have been the man in the song. The song was even more painful now than it had been after his mother's death. The words would not leave him alone. "When the moon was out to sea, the moon was out to sea, and she was taking leave of me, I said, 'Cheer up. There'll always be sailors ashore in Venezuela, ashore in Venezuela.'" Was that all it had meant to Quentin? It could not have been all. Simon pushed open the screen door to the promenade deck with a furious gesture. Much of the water in the pool had splashed over the wooden sides during the night. Nevertheless, Simon and Charles chose the foot of cool ocean water rather than the cabin shower. When they had rolled about till they were thoroughly wet, one of the sailors climbed up to the deck and indicated to them that he was going to drain and refill the pool. Simon and Charles got out and stood at the deck rails, looking across the water to a long, dim shadow on the horizon. South America, Charles said. It's really very exciting, but Simon felt nothing but an aching sadness. He continued to be passed from person to person, never left on his own. He was silently grateful. He did not want to be left alone with his thoughts. His flesh prickled with apprehension. He was sure that Mr. Theo was not a secret murderer. His pheromones told him that Dr. Wordsworth had a violent temper and cause to dislike Cousin Forsyth, but that, except in a moment of passion, she would not murder. The carefully stacked wood from the portrait's crate spoke of premeditation, or at least a kind of cool surrounding the murder, which he did not think was part of Dr. Wordsworth's personality. But that left everybody else on the ship to be afraid of. Nobody and nothing was to be trusted, not even his memories. Shortly after 10 o'clock in the morning, Lyle Boone took Simon up to the bridge. "You are privileged," Boone said. "The one time the passengers are never allowed near the bridge is when we are taking on the pilot and bringing the ship into dock. You must stand out of the way and not ask questions." The captain gave Simon the briefest of preoccupied nods. Simon stood just outside the bridge cabin and watched a small bug of a boat approach them from the direction of land. The bug sidled up beside the Orion, and a man sprang out, clambered up a rope ladder, and landed lightly on the lower deck. "The pilot. Keep out of the way," Lyle Boone warned Simon. "He'll be up on the bridge in a minute. Stand here, don't ask questions. The captain has a very short temper when we're docking. Watch, and anything you want to know I'll tell you later." "Yes, sir." Simon pressed against the rail, where he could see everything and not be underfoot. Ahead of him was the busy harbor of Port of Dragons. Above it rose what appeared to be hundreds of tiny shacks crowding up the steep hillside above the harbor. The wind was sultry and saturated with moisture. He pulled Geraldo's cap further forward to keep his hair from blowing in his eyes, and to shade them from the brilliance of sun on water. Under the cap he could feel perspiration. His shirt began to cling moistly. The weight of the unknown future lay on him as heavily as the heat. The other passengers stood in little groups on the promenade deck. "I don't know what's the matter with the pilot," Dr. Wordsworth remarked to the Smiths. "We've been backing and filling in a most inept manner. I gather the captain has a low tolerance for fools. This certainly must have broken his tolerance level." "It seems to be a problem in parallel parking," Mr. Smith said. "I find parallel parking difficult with an automobile, and it must be far more of a problem for a ship. There's only one berth left free, with a freighter on either side. Port of Dragons surely is a busy harbor." Mr. Theo and Dr. O'Keefe stood side by side. "The forklifts are just sitting there," Mr. Theo remarked. "I suppose we won't be allowed to unload anything until the police have been all over the ship. I expect Tom by mid-afternoon." His words were drowned out by shouting on the dock. Sailors from the Orion threw heavy ropes across the dark water between ship and shore. The ropes were caught by longshoremen and hitched around iron stanchions. Slowly the ship inched landward to bump gently against the old tires which were fastened to the wooden pilings of the dock. Primitive, but excellent bumpers. On the quay stood a bevy of uniformed officials, talking loudly and with much gesturing and flinging of arms, shouting to the longshoremen, who in turn shouted to the sailors on the Orion until the gangplank was dropped with a clatter, and ship and shore were connected. The officials bustled into the ship, and disappeared. Charles said to his sister, "Jan and Geraldo have drinks and cigars set out in the salon." "For the customs men," Polly said. "Geraldo says they always do, not just when there's a murder." "Ouch, that sounds awful, doesn't it? Just when there's a murder." "Oh dear, are we getting hardened?" "Inured, maybe." "Isn't that the same thing?" "Not quite. You can get used to something without being hardened. The cigars and stuff aren't just for the customs officials this time," Charles said. "I wonder what they'll do." The customs officers? The police," Polly said in an overly matter-of-fact voice. "They'd better get Cousin Forsyth out of the hearse and into some ice pretty quickly. In this weather, by this time, he stinketh." Charles asked, Will they want an autopsy? I suppose so. It's what's done. But there wouldn't seem to be much doubt about the cause of death. Not much point in sticking a dagger into the heart of someone who's already dead, for instance. And the dagger doesn't afford a clue. It's Venezuelan, the kind that can be picked up in any port, and most of the sailors have them because they're decorative, and they take them home for presents. Oh, Charles, I've been trying to look at it all objectively like Uncle Father, but the thing that throws me is that I thought Cousin Forsyth was after Simon, and now... Charles spoke quietly. I still think he was. I have the strongest feeling that if Cousin Forsyth hadn't been got out of the way, he might have succeeded in killing Simon. You mean someone killed him to save Simon? Polly asked hopefully. I don't know. There are a whole bunch of threads, and they're all tangled up. But I still think Cousin Forsyth boded no good for Simon. He held up a hand and pointed. All the passengers hurried to the rail and watched as a short, excited official ran down the gangplank to dock and began shouting and gesticulating. A large elevator lift maneuvered alongside the Orion. The passengers could not see what was happening on the foredeck, but it was obvious from the increased shouting and excitement that it was something important. A great yellow metal arm reached out across the dock and over the Orion. Then it moved slowly back, and the hearse in a cradle of ropes wavered in the air over the oily water between the Orion and the pier. The passengers watched in fascination as the hearse swung back and forth, tilted, righted, and finally, with a bump, was set down on the dock. The second official ran down the gangplank, shouted in unintelligible Spanish to the men on the dock, ran to the first official, shouted some more, and then the two chief officials got into the hearse and it drove off. Could you understand what they were saying? Charles asked. Only a few words. It was some kind of dialect. I think they're driving right to the morgue. Charles poked her, and she looked up to see Boone coming out of the promenade deck with Simon and then going back into the ship. Simon hurried toward them. His voice was studiedly casual. I wish y'all could have been up on the bridge with me. I had to stay way out of the way, and even so, the captain got in a towering rage and yelled all kinds of things in both Dutch and Spanish at Mynheer Boone and the pilot. I couldn't understand a word, but he obviously was giving them Hades. Mynheer Boone says he doesn't really mean it, and this was a different docking, and everybody is all uptight. I mean, even more than usual. Then he said in a voice so low that they could hardly hear him, He's gone, Cousin Forsyth. Yes, Simon, Polly said, we saw. His eyes looked dark in his pale face. It seemed so strange to think of him being in the hearse when it was swinging there over the water and the edge of the dock. And it tilted and... Polly said in a matter-of-fact way, a freighter doesn't have a hospital, and it was the most prompt and effective way to get him directly to the morgue. Charles said, Simon, just remember that Aunt Leonis is coming and she'll be here before dinner. Do you think he'll be allowed to go to the airport to meet her? The captain says it depends on the local police, but he'll try to arrange it. Think about that, then. The heat bore down. After lunch, the captain came out to the promenade deck and called Simon. El Señor Jefe de Policio Gutierrez, Chief of Police in Port of Dragons, will take you out to the airport to meet Miss Fair. He smiled at the boy. Come. Simon followed Van Layden through the ship, down the gangplank, to an official-looking black car with a seal on the door. A small, pot-bellied man with shiny dark hair and a perspiring face was introduced as El Señor Jefe de Policia Gutierrez. His black wax mustache was far more impressive than Cousin Forsyth's had been, its points curling up to the middle of his cheeks. But it was the only impressive thing about him. His white summer uniform was wrinkled and dark with sweat, and he was dancing about impatiently. Simon shook hands. How do you do, sir? He inquired carefully in Spanish. Simon's Spanish words evidently relieved El Señor Gutierrez, who began to gabble away until Simon stopped him and asked him to please slow down. This appeared to be a difficult request. Señor Gutierrez blew a small silver whistle and was almost immediately surrounded by excited subordinates. He exhausted a stream of incomprehensible Spanish, his voice rising to a high pitch. Minions ran in every direction, and then Gutierrez bowed politely to Simon and said, We will drive to the airport now, and you will answer me some questions. Yes? It will not be difficult for you. Then we will arrange a happy meeting with the elderly lady. Yes? Yes, please, sir. Gutierrez opened the right-hand door of the front seat for Simon, and he got in behind the wheel. I myself will drive so that we will be private. He took out a large silk handkerchief, flicked some imaginary dust off the steering wheel, and mopped his brow. Simon reached out to make sure that his window was open. The car was a hot box. Gutierrez took a cigar from several of his breast pockets, Dutch cigars, and lit up. The smoke made Simon feel queasy, but he tried to think only that he was on his way to meet Aunt Leonis. Gutierrez drove rapidly away from the port, waving in a lordly fashion to the soldiers with the machine guns who stood formidably at the exit. They drove along a narrow road above the sea. Gutierrez snapped, "Where is the portrait of the Bolivar?" "It has been stolen, sir." "Aha!" said El Señor de Jefe Policia Gutierrez. "This is what Captain Van Leyden and Senor Boone have told me. The wooden crate was found open, and the portrait has vanished. And all this at sea." "Yes, sir." Gutierrez drove with his foot down on the accelerator until they were traveling on a lonely road with jungle above them to the left and sea below to the right. "How did this portrait of the General come to be in your possession, or come into your possession?" It was an accusation. Gutierrez obviously did not think that Simon had any right. It was an accusation. Gutierrez obviously did not think that Simon had any right to a portrait of Bolivar. But the boy answered courteously, "Not my possession, sir. It belonged to my Aunt Leonis, and she sold it to Cousin Forsyth." "Sold it? Aha! Ahem. Why would she sell such a valuable thing?" "Well, because it was valuable, sir. The only valuable thing she had left, and she had no money." "Impossible. All Americans are rich." The cigar smoke blew heavily through the car. "If she had no money, how could she have bought such a valuable portrait in the first place?" "She didn't buy it, sir. It was hers. It has always been in our family." "Always? Incredible." "Always increíble." "How would an aged American have had a portrait of Bolivar in her family? This is a most unlikely story." Gutierrez spoke around the cigar. Simon's nausea began to be acute. "Why do you speak Spanish?" Simon countered. "Would you prefer me to speak English? It would be much easier for me." "That's not what I am asking. Where did you learn Spanish?" "From Aunt Leonis, sir." Simon had decided definitively that he did not like the El Señor Jefe de Policia Gutierrez, who gave him no more confidence in the police than had Dr. Kurds in the ministry. "Your cigar is making me sick, sir," Simon said, "and I don't think I can speak any more Spanish for a while." Gutierrez frowned his disapproval, but put out his cigar. "You are withholding information." They drove in silence for perhaps 5 minutes. Simon felt sweat trickling down his back between his shoulder blades. Gutierrez's face glistened like melting lard. The landscape widened out and flattened, with broad savanna between the road and the forest. Gutierrez made a long U-turn, and there was the ocean on their left, pounding into shore. "We are here," Gutierrez said. The airport for Port of Dragons was little more than a short runway along a strip of dirty beach. The surf was pounding in heavily, and the spume was a mustardy yellow instead of white. Everything brassily reflected the heat of the sun. There was a bird's nest in a windsock. A small plane was parked like a clumsy bird on the airship. Aunt Leonis's plane? If so, where was she? Across the airstrip, from the ocean, was a small wooden shack, outside which a soldier lounged, a rifle swung from his shoulder. By the shack, a hearse stood, black and shining and hot. The hearse. The sun smacked against the bullet hole in the windshield, and the light burst back. "The hearse!" Simon's throat was dry. "Why is the hearse?" Gutierrez did not reply. He drew the car close to the rear of the hearse. Is Cousin Forsyth?" No, Gutierrez answered soothingly. "He's in the morgue. It is all right. Come, I will show you." "Aunt Leonis?" "Her plane is not in yet. There are headwinds. We have time. Come." He opened the door and pushed himself out from under the wheel. Simon did not move. Gutierrez walked around the car and opened the door on Simon's side. "Come." Simon pressed back, his bare legs below his shorts sticking to the seat. His dislike of Gutierrez had turned to anger, and the anger to terror. Gutierrez reached in and took his arm in a firm grip. The rotund little man was far stronger than he looked. Simon was hauled forcibly out of the car, yanked from the stuffy, smoky, sweaty heat of the interior into the blazing broil of the sun. Was Aunt Leonis waiting in the shade inside the shack? Was Gutierrez lying to him? Please, please be there. He struggled to get loose and run to the shack, but Gutierrez's flabby-looking arms were like iron, and he dragged the boy toward the hearse. The Venezuelan voice was gentle in contrast to his fingers, which were bruising Simon's arm. Don't be afraid, don't fight me, and you won't get hurt. I just want to show you something. The rifle-slung soldier moved swiftly from the shack, over the short distance to the hearse, and flung open the double doors. Then he and Gutierrez together picked Simon up bodily and threw him into the hearse and slammed the doors shut behind him. Simon landed on something pliable, someone, a body. And that is the end of chapter 9.